Cold as ice, black-faced, breathless, crying like a bull or a bear or a swine, shouting that he was God, that there was no God, that he was Christ. From An Apology for the Possession of William Sommers, printed 1599. An Elizabethan English exorcist, impostor or genuine, the case of John Darrell. I'll be doing shorter videos on each of the possessions which Darrell exorcised, but for now, let's dive deep into the story. It has fascinated me for years. A man appears from nowhere, exorcises several people, is attacked by the Church of England, then vanishes into the shadows. This is another story from the Unquiet archive. England, the East Midlands, 1580s and 1590s. John Darrell is instrumental in over 10 exorcisms throughout 6 counties. Enter stage left Samuel Harsnett, chaplain to the Bishop of London. He was not amused. He saw a chance for advancement. What followed led to a very public pamphlet war. Where were YouTube or Facebook when you needed them? Darrell was imprisoned, prosecuted, defrocked, then vanished. Was he too much for fraud or too genuine for the Church of England? Throughout the 1580s and 90s, Darrell's stage spread across Derbyshire and Leicestershire, with the 1586 exorcism of Katharine Wright, Burton-on-Trent, Derbyshire, Thomas Darling, or the Boy of Burton, as he became known, Staffordshire, the small place called Whittington, the mysterious Seven of Lancashire, and Nottingham with William Sommers himself. And we'll go into each in more detail, but first, who exactly was John Darrell? Before the scandal, before the trials and pamphlets and cries of fraud, there was simply John Darrell, a young man from Nottinghamshire, a county in the middle of England, where Robin Hood came from. Darrell was born in 1562 near Mansfield, the second town of the county, more recently a centre of coal mining, but there's no record of his baptism in the parish register of St Peter's, the main church in the town, in a time when recording baptisms was required by law, because, officially, regardless of your actual faith, everyone was Church of England. For the nerdy amongst us, this and the recording of marriages and burials was mandated in 1538 by Thomas Cromwell, acting in his role as the vice-regent of the king and spirituals. We're in the era of the English Protestant Reformation, which began in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, which severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church and saw Henry VIII become the supreme head of the Church of England. It's a time of conflict and religious persecution. We know Darrell died sometime after 1607, but when, where, no one's quite sure. Even his entry in the official Dictionary of National Biography draws a blank, although it does acknowledge his occupation as exorcist. Darrell was born into yeoman stock, respectable but not wealthy. His father, Henry Darrell, farmed a small estate, the kind of family that worked the land, held local standing, but didn't make waves, or at least hadn't yet. In 1575, Darrell was admitted to Queen's College, Cambridge as a sizar. This meant he received help with tuition fees in exchange for working as a kind of servant to the richer students. It was a system that opened the doors of learning, but reminded you of your place. 4 years later, in 1579, he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts. He studied law at the Inns of Court in London, where he'd have seen the rough politics of the Elizabethan courtroom. But instead of pursuing law, he returned to the Ashfield area to farm and to become an exorcist. In 1592, he sold up and moved to Ashby-de-la-Zouch, where he bought a small farm. More importantly, he became close to Arthur Hildesheim, one of the great Puritan preachers of his day. By the time he was asked to perform his first exorcism in 1586 in Derbyshire, he had already immersed himself in the belief that prayer and fasting could cast out devils. From there, his fame grew fast and dangerously. In 1596 and 97, Darrell cast out devils at St Mary's Church, Nottingham, was appointed curate by Robert Aldridge, took part in the dramatic Lancashire 7 case, where demons were allegedly driven from 7 members of the Starkey household in Tyldesley, claimed he could name 13 witches in a single town in Staffordshire. For a man of no official authority in the exorcist business, Darrell was moving with frightening boldness. Had he become convinced that God had chosen him to drive out the devil? When we talk about the Elizabethan obsession with exorcisms, devils, ghosts and possessions, we might ask ourselves, what exactly was a ghost? And what was Darrell so successful at exorcising? Today, we might say, a ghost is the spirit of a dead person. That's simple enough. But in the 16th century, the answer wasn't just complicated, it was dangerous. In the old Roman Catholic tradition, ghosts were the dead in need of help. Trapped in purgatory, they returned seeking prayers, intercession, or the righting of wrongs. They were our ancestors. They were warnings. They were restless souls in limbo. However, the Protestant Reformation shattered that view. With purgatory effectively abolished, there was no acceptable place for a wandering spirit. So when someone claimed they saw a ghost, the Protestant answer was blunt. That's not your grandma. That's a demon in disguise. This shift had chilling consequences. What might have been a comforting visit from a lost child became a test of your faith and a whisper in the night, not from heaven, but from hell. Modern theologians like Jean-Claude Schmitt in Ghosts in the Middle Ages show us how these beliefs evolved. In earlier centuries, ghosts were part of a divine plan. They consoled, they warned, they even scolded monks in their dreams. But by the time of Elizabeth I, ghosts had become unclean spirits, their motives suspect, their appearances terrifying. And still, people kept seeing them. Shadows in doorways, cold spots by the hearth, strange knocks in the night. England, racked by religious upheaval and poor harvests, was a haunted land, a place where spiritual explanations filled the cracks left by war, poverty and plague. Ghosts weren't just the dead, they were mirrors of society's fears. The outsider, the old woman living alone, the child who wouldn't behave. Sound familiar? These same anxieties would fuel the witch trials like Pendle in 1613, where 10 people were hanged for supposedly causing death through witchcraft. And later in Salem in America in the early 1690s, another 19 were hanged for witchcraft. New England, we might add, was settled by the very religious community whom our John Darrell counted as friends. So how did Elizabethans fight back? When no one else could help, they didn't call either the A-Team or Ghostbusters. But you did have some choices. Go to a cunning man or a wise woman. They'd use herbs, charms, whispered prayers. Or you could call someone like John Darrell. Darrell didn't need a relic. He needed faith. He offered a new answer for an old fear. Not magic, not ritual, but prayer and fasting. As it says in the Bible, Mark 9, verse 29, "And he said unto them, This kind can come forth by nothing, but by prayer and fasting." And for a while, people believed him. But when the line between ghost, demon and political threat started to blur, Darrell's answers became inconvenient and dangerous. The case of Katharine Wright, 1586. Our story begins in the quiet hamlet of Ridgeway Lane near Eckington in Derbyshire. It's 1586, and a 17-year-old girl named Katherine Wright begins to behave strangely. Her home life was already troubled. Her father had passed away. Her mother, Cecily, remarried a man named John Meakin. He was a chaff cutter who cut straw into fine pieces for animal fodder. He was also a man known for his violent temper and a string of nasty land disputes with the extended Wright family. Just days after a local case about unpaid debts was finally settled, Katherine's body began to swell. She suffered from migraines, hallucinations, nightmares, visions of standing on a precipice above pits of fire and water, and then came the screaming fits. She stopped sleeping. She would fall to the ground in violent trances. She claimed to see the ghost of a child without feet while fetching water at a well. The talk of possession spread through the village like fire through dry bracken. Visitors began arriving at her house, but the situation was so unstable that Katherine was sent to stay with a local gentleman, Edward Beresford of Cutthorpe in Brampton, because, as one observer put it, her father's house was no fit place to give entertainment to any that should come to help her. In other words, it was no fit place for visitors. Enter Arthur the Conjurer, a local cunning man. He used charms and forbidden rituals, but under the Witchcraft Act of 1563, all forms of magical practice were illegal. Arthur was arrested by Lord John Darcy, and suspicion turned from spirits to people. Had Katherine been bewitched? Katherine pointed the finger at a poor woman named Margaret Roper, to whom she had once refused charity. She claimed that Roper had sent a legion of fiends into her, but not everyone was convinced. Samuel Harsnett, who would later become one of Darrell's fiercest critics, dismissed Katherine as idle-headed and suggested her possession was just the result of want of sleep, or perhaps the trauma of living with a violent man, the latter not being an unreasonable suggestion. Even John Meakin stopped beating Katherine once she began speaking of visions. Desperate for help, the local rector of Bilsthorpe, Thomas Beckingham, turned to someone gaining a reputation in Puritan circles, John Darrell. Beckingham wasn't convinced of Katherine's possession, but he was intrigued. He passed the case to Darrell, then a lay preacher described as a healer and a man of prayer. Katherine was sent to Mansfield to meet him. She stayed with a yeoman named Edward Loads, and she later testified that Darrell was the first to tell her she had a devil in her. Darrell arrived with his pregnant wife Joan, daughter Marjorie, and a godly couple named Henry and Isabel Cross. Puritanism, after all, ran on what they called the Brotherhood of the Godly, and who hasn't taken their child to work with them? Katherine now claimed supernatural strength and even clairvoyance. Darrell detected 7 devils, including one named Middle Cub. He began the exorcism with prayer and fasting, just as Christ had done in the wilderness. And yet, he also laid himself upon her stomach during a fit. Beckingham was so horrified that he dragged Darrell from the room. This moment would later be used by the High Commission to accuse Darrell of lewdness. It was certainly an unusual exorcist technique. The cure lasted only a month. Katherine relapsed after eating bread, interpreted by some as an anti-communion, a diabolical inversion of the Eucharist. When Darrell returned, there were hundreds present. Even her brother, Thomas Wright and Beresford, began to suspect fakery. Darrell again asked the possessing spirit to name the witch. Middle Cub identified Margaret Roper. Darrell approached local magistrate Godfrey Foljambe, asking for Roper's arrest, but Foljambe refused. He could see no evidence. Instead, he threatened Darrell with prison. Undeterred, Darrell persuaded Roper to return with him to see Katherine Wright. He asked Katherine to scratch her, a superstition believed to draw the witch's blood and break her spell. Even some Puritans called this blasphemous. Darrell spent 3 days praying. But the affliction returned yet again. By now, even her old tormentor Meeking was fed up. He accused Darrell of claiming success while doing nothing. Katherine would later say she continued to suffer from fits, hallucinations and swelling for 12 years. As for Darrell, well, this would not be the last time he was accused of faking a cure. The case of Katharine Wright ended not in triumph, but in uncertainty. She was a teenage girl living in a violent household in a village that whispered behind closed doors. She saw visions, she collapsed, she screamed of devils, and yes, she told Darrell a witch had cursed her. But perhaps Darrell saw more than demons that spring in Derbyshire. Perhaps he recognised a child who was trying to make sense of abuse, of powerlessness, of pain that had no language except the supernatural. Maybe that's why he backed away. He didn't publish an account, he didn't stage a final deliverance. He left, quietly, and turned instead to another case, one that would become one of his most famous. A boy in Burton-on-Trent, with a crowd gathered outside the door, and there the spotlight would shine again on John Darrell. The boy of Burton. In 1596, a 13-year-old boy from Burton-on-Trent, Derbyshire, began to suffer terrifying symptoms. Screaming fits, strange visions, bodily contortions. He claimed he was haunted by the image of a woman in a black gown who had cursed him after he got lost in the woods. His name was Thomas Darling, and his story would make him infamous as the boy of Burton. Darling's condition echoed that of Katharine Wright just a decade earlier. The same symptoms, the same mounting hysteria. This time, the accused was a local woman named Alice Goodrich. She was convicted of bewitching Darling and thrown into prison, where she died before her trial could be completed. No confession, no defence, no mercy. On 27th of May, John Darrell arrived. He examined Darling and declared him possessed, prescribing a familiar cure, prayer and fasting. But curiously, Darrell refused to take part in the exorcism himself. He later claimed he feared accusations of self-promotion, that others might believe he was seeking glory rather than God's work. Darling, however, would later tell a different story. He claimed that Darrell had doubted his possession altogether. The case was quickly turned into print. In 1597, a pamphlet was published, the most wonderful and true story of a boy possessed. It spread Darrell's message and his method far and wide. But not everyone was convinced. As we'll see, this case became one more thread in the tangled web of exorcism, suspicion, and pamphlet warfare that would define Darrell's legacy. The Lancashire Seven. In 1597, John Darrell travelled to Clayworth Hall, Lancashire, to cast out a devil, or perhaps 7 of them. It was his most dramatic case yet. A full household gripped by convulsions, visions and voices, a community paralysed by fear. And it all began in the home of Nicholas Starkey. Starkey was a wealthy man. His wife, Anne Burton, had inherited a considerable fortune. Her family were less pleased. Her inheritance had passed into Starkey's hands, and bitterness began to fester. Some even whispered that her relatives had prayed for the death of the couple's children. Probably a coincidence, but 4 of those children died. It was February 1594 when things first turned strange. Their surviving daughter Anne grew melancholy. Her brother began to scream uncontrollably. Other children in the house developed fits, seizures, trances. Whatever it was spreading. Starkey tried everything. He spent £200 on medical treatments. According to the Bank of England's inflation calculator, this was the equivalent of over £55,000 today. He was a man desperate for relief, for an answer. In desperation, he did something dangerous. He turned to a Catholic priest. A bold move in Protestant England, where open Catholicism could still land you in prison, or worse. Then came the second risk. He summoned a cunning man, Edmund Hartley. Hartley was a herbalist and a sorcerer of sorts. He claimed he could cure the afflicted using charms, symbols and strange powders. The children were removed from the house for 18 months while Hartley worked his remedies. But whispers began to circulate. People said it was all a trick of the devil, that Hartley's circles and rituals weren't healing the children, they were binding them. And Hartley began to demand more and more money. So Starkey tried again. He turned to another famous name, Dr. John Dee, the magician, mathematician, and angel converser who served as warden of Manchester College. Dee's story of angelic conversations, adventures in Poland with Edward Kelly, the recording of the language, Enochian, and other tall tales will be covered in another video. Dee had been exiled to Manchester from his home in Mortlake, Surrey, and away from his social network. But even Dee refused to get involved in the Starkey case. Maybe he had learned his lesson. He'd spent decades treading the dangerous line between science and sorcery. He was weary, and he was being watched. By January 1596, the household was in chaos. More children, 3 fostered in the home, began to convulse. Even the maidservants and a visitor from Salford, Margaret Byram, succumbed to fits. The authorities stepped in. Hartley, the cunning man, was arrested, charged with witchcraft, and hanged. But the spirits didn't stop. Starkey needed someone else, someone with holy fire, someone who claimed to drive out demons with prayer and fasting alone. He found him through a curious connection. One of Dee's servants, Richard Walkden, was cousin to Thomas Darling, the boy of Burton, another of Darrell's possessed protégés. It was through this network that Starkey sent word to John Darrell. Starkey, Dee and a justice of the peace all wrote separate letters to Darrell. Eventually he relented and agreed to offer his services. On 16th of March 1597, Darrell arrived at the Starkey home in Clayworth, a county seen by many as the wild edge of Protestant England, a place where Catholicism clung on and magic still whispered in hedgerows. Darrell entered a house where 7 people, children and adults, believed they were possessed, where a cunning man had failed and a magician had declined to tread. Now, it was up to him. What happened next would cement Darrell's fame and mark the beginning of his end. So what happened to the Lancashire 7 at Clayworth Hall? George Moore, another non-beneficed preacher, which meant he was not attached to a parish providing a salary, accompanied Darrell on the trip. During dinner, 5 of the children, seated round the table, had convulsions with stomachs swelling abnormally with lumps visible beneath the skin. Has anyone seen Alien? They said the authorities might hang Hartley, but they could not hang the devil. The demonic language became threatening, and then physical violence began. All 7 were moved into a single room for inspection by Darrell and Moore. They committed blasphemy, calling the Holy Bible nothing more than bibble-babble. Eventually, Moore and Darrell retreated for the night. Next day, a pastor at Lee called John Dickons was summoned. Moore wrote, "We are greatly discouraged, not knowing well what to do." The 3 men decided to use prayer and fasting. At 7 a.m. the next day, the possessed were laid on individual couches in the parlour. Over 30 people were present to watch. They prayed and they gave sermons until 3 p.m. Until Margaret Hardman, one of the possessed, exclaimed, "I am too hot, I am too hot, let me go, let me go." The 7 roared and writhed in agony. The crowd was scared. The ministers said now was the time to complete the deliverance, and the evil spirits were drawn from the possessed. Darrell, Moore and Dickons had prevailed. The Sins of Nottingham, performed by a devil. On the 5th of November 1597, the people of Nottingham gathered to witness a performance, not in a theatre, but in a private house, not an actor, but a boy called William Sommers, and not a play, but a possession. He screamed, he collapsed, he cried out in strange voices, and before long the whispers began. People said he was possessed. John Darrell had not yet met Sommers, but his sister-in-law, who had seen his work before, urged that he be consulted. Darrell diagnosed demonic possession via letter and prescribed his usual cure, prayer and fasting. When the mayor, Peter Clark, sent a formal request, Darrell arrived in Nottingham. According to a manuscript once kept at Woollerton Hall, which would later stand in for Batman's Wayne Manor in The Dark Knight Rises, this was the day the devil showed the sins of the people. In 1597, Nottingham was gripped by spiritual crisis, and at its centre stood the young apprentice, William Sommers. He had suffered from strange fits, violent contortions, unconscious trances, and outbursts no physician could explain. Some whispered maybe it was epilepsy, others claimed devil possession. He'd recently run away from his master and his behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic. He claimed visions, made odd gestures, accused a local woman of bewitching him. All, it seems, after a disagreement over a hatband. As with all of these cases, word began to spread fast. What unfolded was a grotesque moral pageant. The Woollerton manuscript recounts in 25 parts the acts and gestures Sommers performed, allegedly under the influence of the devil, to reveal the vices of Nottingham. Each was a silent sermon, and each more scandalous than the last. First, he mocked, he mouthed, he mowed and floated, pulling faces at those who came to see him. This, the devil claimed, was the sin of scorn. Then came the tailors, deceitful, dishonest in their cuts. The antic dancers clapped and twisted, grotesque and lewd. He showed horns on his forehead with his hands, perhaps mocking cuckolds or the devil himself. He mimed fighting with swords and daggers, playing dice and dropping travellers on the highway, even putting on imaginary boots and spurs to escape. And then it grew darker. He acted out the sin of theft, creeping and hiding like a cutpurse. He mimed gluttony, eating so much that he vomited. He acted drunkenness, quaffing, staggering, falling down, and sleeping it off like a beast. The devil even demonstrated the pride of women, ruffs and farthingales and busks, twirling curls and preening in the mirror, showing how they adjusted their garments, clapped their cuffs and posed their lips. And men were not spared either. The manuscript describes the devil mocking their corkscrew shoes, their long hair, their perfume moustaches, and their delight in barbers' tricks, picking their ears, stroking their beards, and sniffing sweet oils. Perhaps most chilling of all, Sommers pretended to be in church. He opened a book, then fell asleep, snoring loudly. He pretended to wake, muttered, "Oh, God be thanked," sarcastically, and laughed, mocking the shallow piety of those who came to worship but could not keep awake. Darrell, present for the whole spectacle, called out, "Look upon me cheerfully, William." Sommers replied, "I fear it be not William that speaketh," then laughed again, confessing he had deceived the minister. This was no ordinary possession. It was a performance of social sin, gambling, whoring, preening, skipping church, being too proud of your shoes. Each sin was acted out with uncanny skill. The manuscript says Sommers was deaf, dumb and blind throughout, yet he mimicked drunken vomiting, pickpocket trickery, and seductive gestures better than any player on the London stage. So what were we witnessing here? Was he possessed? Was this a form of Puritan street theatre co-produced by Darrell and friends? Or was Sommers a traumatised teenager manipulated into public humiliation? Whatever the truth, this episode shows us that possession in early modern England was more than supernatural. It was cultural commentary, a sermon in gestures, haunted mirror held up to a town that perhaps needed to see itself. What followed was as much public theatre as private healing. Crowds gathered outside the house. The privileged were allowed to witness Sommers' fits for themselves. Darrell announced that Sommers' condition was no accident. It was a punishment for the sins of the people of Nottingham and the sins of Sommers' parents. Vicar Robert Aldridge of St Mary's Church declared the fits a divine warning. Darrell called for a public fast and a day of prayer. Around 150 people gathered, crying out, "Lord, have mercy on us! Lord, have mercy on us!" Sommers found temporary relief. Darrell found public acclaim and was appointed preacher at St Mary's. But the case wasn't over. Behind the scenes, Sommers had a strange past. He'd once served in Darrell's own village, Ashby de la Zouche. Some say he'd been coached in how to behave. Some said he could perform possession on cue. And Darrell had his own list, 14 signs of devil possession, all of which Sommers had conveniently displayed. But the spectacle grew. Sommers began identifying witches, just like other possessed figures Darrell had worked with. 13 women were arrested. One was Alice Freeman, niece to an alderman. Behind the spectacle, cracks were forming. Darrell had a troubling habit of predicting that his patients would be possessed again, and somehow they always were. In front of Sommers, Darrell spoke of Thomas Darling and the possessed household in Lancashire, cases where the afflicted had named witches. Soon, Sommers began doing the same. 13 women were arrested, interrogated by the mayor and alderman. One of them, Alice Freeman, was the niece of an alderman. 11 were eventually released. Darrell now stood at a crossroads: deny the witch hunt or risk losing his most devoted followers. He chose the latter. By January 1598, Sommers' fits began again. In February, Darrell's opponents moved Sommers to the local workhouse, and there he confessed. He admitted his fits had been faked. He admitted that he had lied, that Darrell had taught him how to perform the convulsions, how to mimic the signs of possession in order to spread his fame. The fallout was immediate. Sommers became the church's star witness in the trial of John Darrell, and in a manuscript now at Lambeth Palace, Darrell himself, under pressure, allegedly confessed to causing false possession through suggestion and prayer. From public hero to convicted fraud, Darrell's fate was sealed. And William Sommers? Well, he fades from the records like a strange footnote to a moral panic that rocked an entire city. Rival preachers began delivering sermons for and against Darrell. The debate exploded. Darrell's allies appealed to Archbishop Matthew Hutton of York, who had Puritan sympathies. His enemies, including John Walton, the Archdeacon of Derby, appealed to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the powerful Court of High Commission in London. Hutton sent a commission of inquiry to Nottingham. It met on the 20th of March 1598. The panel included John Thorold, the High Sheriff, Sir John Byron, the Mayor, the Alderman, and local clergymen. Sommers was returned to familiar surroundings, and his fits began again. The commissioners ruled that the fits were genuine, but a month later, Darrell was summoned to York and his licence to preach was revoked. Darrell announced one final act of defiance, a day of prayer and fasting to exorcise Sommers once and for all and prove his work true. But his opponent struck first. Sir Edmund Anderson, Lord Justice of the Common Pleas, was in Nottingham for the assizes. The assizes were the equivalent of the Crown Court today, which tries more serious crimes. Sir Edmund Anderson personally examined Sommers on the 31st of March. Sommers confessed again. He was sent to London as a witness for the prosecution. Darrell was arrested alongside George Moore and they were tried by the Court of High Commission in London, this time under the watchful eye of Bishop Bancroft, a staunch opponent of Puritanism. Darrell was imprisoned, degraded from orders, and publicly discredited. A new commission was appointed, including Samuel Harsnett, Bancroft's chaplain, who would soon become Darrell's greatest enemy in print. Witnesses were re-examined. Prominent Puritan ministers, including Richard Bernard, Arthur Hildersham and John Brinsley, were all caught up in the fallout. Darrell's network of support became a list of suspects. Harsnett wrote a detailed account of the trial, drawing on the testimonies of Sommers, Darling and 17 other witnesses. He argued that Darrell was not only a fraud, he was also a danger, a man who trained his patients to simulate symptoms, who turned fear and faith into performance, and then used those performances to build a movement. Meanwhile, inside his prison cell, Darrell was still writing. William Bradshaw, Fellow of Sidney Sussex College and father of the Independents, smuggled Darrell's books into Cambridge. He was censored by the High Commission. The war over Darrell's soul was now a war over England's future. Darrell was eventually released around 1601. He returned quietly to Mansfield, perhaps to farm. He knew prominent Puritans like John Smith and John Robinson who would help found the Mayflower colony, and he was presented for not receiving communion in 1607. Document perhaps written by him, a treatise of the church, appeared in 1617. After that, silence. There's no burial entry that has been found for John Darrell. Perhaps he went to the New World on the Mayflower. Darrell may have been a fraud, or he may have been sincere. But what do you think? Why don't you let me know in the comments below? Was Darrell an exorcist, or was he a fraud? But what terrified the church most wasn't just what Darrell said, it was how many people listened. William Sommers, the eyewitness accounts. William Sommers was not alone in the dark. His case, widely debated, was meticulously recorded in a pamphlet titled A Brief Narration of the Possession, Dispossession and Repossession of William Sommers. Published in Amsterdam in 1598, it attempts to counter the rising claims that he had been faking it all. It opens with a striking image. William Sommers of Nottingham, of the age of 19 or 20 years, about the beginning of October 1597, began to be strangely tormented in body and gave great tokens that he was possessed by a wicked spirit. An eyewitness, William Hind, a local tailor, gave sworn testimony of what he saw: a swelling in the neck, to the bigness of a walnut, then to the cheekbone, to a great hazelnut, and from thence it moved into his eye. The skin of his eye waxed black. At first, Hind had been sceptical. He'd heard the boy was counterfeiting, pretending, but when he placed his hand on the swelling, something changed. It trembled like an aspen leaf in a calm wind. The lump was soft, unnatural, and yet the skin retained its colour. No bruising, no visible sign of trickery. To Hind, and to many others, this was no simple fraud. This was evidence. And in a time when pamphlets stood in for newspapers, Facebook, TikTok and YouTube, these testimonies, strange, stirring and specific, became the proof upon which reputations, careers and even theology were made or unmade. Prosecutor Samuel Harsnett. Every great drama needs its antagonist. In the case of John Darrell, that role was played by Samuel Harsnett, clergyman, scholar and future archbishop. By 1597, Harsnett was already chaplain to Bishop Bancroft of London. He was a rising star with a sharp wit and a sharper pen. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, ordered an official investigation. The accusation, fraudulent exorcism, as if there could be a non-fraudulent type. Darrell was hauled before the Court of High Commission, a powerful arm of ecclesiastical law in London. He was deprived of his ministry, imprisoned for 18 months alongside the Puritan minister George Moore. When he was released, Darrell disappeared, at least from the pulpit. When Darrell's exorcisms started attracting crowds and concern, it was Harsnett who sat on the commission to investigate. He was not impressed. In 1599, he published his findings, a discovery of the fraudulent practices of John Darrell, a pointed, cynical account that dismantled Darrell's claims piece by piece. Sommers, Darling, Wright, all dismissed as coached, confused, or downright liars. But Harsnett wasn't finished there. In 1603, he turned his gaze to a wider target, Roman Catholicism itself. In A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostures, perhaps one of the best pamphlet titles of all time, Harsnett accused Jesuits and Catholic priests of engineering fake possessions to manipulate the faithful, and in doing so, he gave English literature one of its strangest gifts. Flibbertigibbet, Smallkill, Farturetto, Obidicut, the names of demons from Darrell's own account, which Harsnett included in his pamphlets. They were later lifted straight from these pages by Shakespeare and put into the mouths of madmen and kings. King Lear would never be the same again. Unlike King James I, who was obsessed with witches and the devil, Harsnett was a skeptic. To him, all this talk of spirits, devils and exorcism was dangerous fantasy, a challenge to the authority and order of the Church of England. And so he crushed it. Darrell was ruined, the canons were rewritten, and exorcism, without episcopal licence, became illegal. The Pamphlet War. Harsnett's revenge. Let's dive deeper into Harsnett's persecution of Darrell. John Darrell might have believed he was doing God's work, but others believed he was doing something quite different. Enter Samuel Harsnett, the most zealous and articulate of Darrell's critics. In 1599, he published A Discovery of the Fraudulent Practices of John Darrell, Bachelor of Arts. It was no gentle disagreement. This was a full-blown character assassination, a literary prosecution in 200 pages of polished fury. Harsnett tore through Darrell's cases, William Sommers, Thomas Darling, Katherine Wright, saying that Sommers' fits grew stale in Nottingham. Harsnett insisted that the whole affair was an elaborate fraud, a show, a juggling trick. Darrell's 18 signs of possession, which included gnashing of teeth, foaming, unnatural strength, and even clairvoyance, were torn apart by Harsnett as nothing more than stagecraft and delusion. He mocked Darrell's claim that, in their fits, the possessed are utterly senseless, and what they do or say is done by the devil in them, not by themselves. To Harsnett, this was preposterous theology, hard to find in even the grossest popish exorcists, he wrote. Darrell's logic, he argued, left no space for truth or responsibility. If a possessed person could speak, reason and respond as though not possessed, then any lie, any deceit could be blamed on the devil and not the sufferer or their exorcist. This was not just bad theology, it was dangerous theatre, and the audiences were all too willing to believe it. Harsnett's war wasn't only with Darrell, it was part of a larger campaign, a Protestant rejection not just of Catholic exorcism, but of all possession narratives. He expanded this assault in 1603 with his broader polemic, A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostures. This work condemned Jesuit exorcisms from the 1580s and was instrumental in shaping the growing English scepticism toward all demonic encounters, whether Catholic or Puritan. Ironically, even as Harsnett attacked Darrell's Protestant zeal, he lumped him in with the very Catholic practices they both claimed to oppose. But Darrell wasn't silenced easily. He continued writing pamphlets of his own, each rebutting the charges, defending his patients, and asserting the purity of his methods, prayer and fasting, as Christ had instructed. Yet the damage was done. Darrell's reputation was in ruins, his career in the church ended, his name remembered more for scandal than for salvation. And Harsnett, well, he rose swiftly. becoming Bishop of Chichester, then Norwich, and finally Archbishop of York. That is the second most senior role in the Church of England, second only to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Some devils were harder to cast out than others. Exorcist on trial, the fall of John Darrell. John Darrell believed that demons were real, but even more than that, he believed they could be driven out, not with relics, but not with ritual, but with prayer and fasting. This was his theology, and this was his downfall. Darrell's method wasn't new. In 1574, the Protestant historian John Fox had used prayer to confront a supposed possession in Buckinghamshire. No fasting, just supplication. So Darrell took it further. He began with prayer, then added fasting, citing the Gospels. This kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. Matthew 17:21. Darrell saw it not as magic, but as petition, an appeal for God's intervention, and for a time it worked. He gained a reputation as England's leading dispossessor. There was no immediate theological objection to his methods, but there was a political one. Darrell was a layman, a Puritan, and a figure outside the church's formal hierarchy. He was performing spiritual warfare without permission, and he was starting to look dangerous. It all came crashing down in 1597 after the sensational dispossession of William Sommers in Nottingham. At first, Sommers seemed like another success story, a tormented young man delivered through prayer, but then came the backlash. The charges: heresy and fraud. The accusation: Darrell had coached Sommers, taught him how to fake the symptoms of possession, to cry out, to twist and contort, to see devils that weren't there. Not for healing, but for fame. Darrell was manufacturing miracles to make himself a celebrity. From exile, Darrell and his supporters launched a furious pamphlet war against his enemies. Between 1598 and 1603, 15 books were published. Darrell believed that if people read his words, they'd understand his truth. He believed his work was godly, and that his accusers were headed for damnation. He wrote, "There is no cause why these Puritans should be hated, despised, abhorred, and so shamefully entreated, as they were rather dogs than men." One of these accusers was Samuel Harsnett. Darrell came to believe that Harsnett wasn't just attacking him, he was trying to destroy the godly themselves. The church responded decisively. In 1604, a new set of ecclesiastical laws, the canons of the Church of England, forbade exorcism without the licence of a bishop, effectively banning the very thing Darrell had built his name on. Exorcism was now regulated. Puritan performance was outlawed. To many in authority, Darrell began to look like another kind of threat, a new Martin Moore prelate. The Moore prelate tracts, printed anonymously from 1588 onwards, had accused the church of corruption, idolatry and greed. They used satire, outrage and secret presses. One of the likely authors, John Penry, was hanged in 1592. Darrell wasn't writing satire, but he was still a Puritan voice outside church control, galvanising support and stirring public sympathy. He spoke directly to readers. He bypassed bishops. He was, in the eyes of many, a radical. After 1603, Darrell faced some view. He may have died. He may have lived quietly, somewhere in hiding. He may have changed his name and taken a berth on the Mayflower. But the man who once cast out devils now vanished like one. Was he a fraud, a fanatic, or just a preacher who believed that good could triumph over evil, if only the church would let it? John Darrell may have vanished from public life after 1602, but his story didn't fade. Instead, it became a warning, a ghost in the margins of English literature, a whisper behind the mask of the devil in the playhouse. In Hamlet, written around the time of Darrell's Pamphlet War, Shakespeare gives voice to the anxiety of an age. Be thou a spirit of health or goblin damned, thou comest in such a questionable shape. A ghost caught between heaven and hell, like so many of Darrell's patients, and perhaps like Darrell himself. The ghost of Hamlet's father describes his fate. Confined to fasting fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. This is purgatory, a Catholic doctrine Elizabethan Protestants officially rejected, but couldn't quite shake from their nightmares. The devil, they insisted, could wear the face of your father. That's the danger. What is the thing we pity? the thing we believe is a lie. Shakespeare was not alone in referencing Darrell's world. In King Lear, the fool mocks with nonsense names, flibbertigibbet, smallkill, straight from Harsnett's declaration of egregious popish impostures, the text written to destroy Darrell's credibility. Lear himself, raving in madness, cries of fiends who possess people and torment their bodies. And Ben Jonson, never one to waste a good scandal, openly mocks Darrell's miraculous cures in The Devil is an Ass, where the devil finds Jacobean London so full of frauds and fools that there's no work left for him. Darrell may have believed he was fighting the devil. By the early 1600s, the devil had become entertainment. Darrell's language, his patience and his prayers were now props, tools for playwrights and satirists. Shaped and reshaped, always suspicious, always questionable. He was never officially rehabilitated, but neither was he forgotten. If you've enjoyed listening to this Elizabethan story from the Unquiet archive, please do consider subscribing so that you don't miss future videos. I'll also be creating smaller videos for each of the possessions, which will also appear on the channel in the coming weeks. So goodbye from the Unquiet archive. The archivist is off to delve into another bunch of manuscripts to bring you chilling stories from the past.